The lake is a community asset, Mr. Jensen. It says so right here in the bylaws I wrote myself. That was the line. That was the sentence that kicked over the first domino in a long, long line of them. It was spoken with the kind of unshakable, smug confidence that only a true tyrant can muster. And it was, of course, a complete and utter lie. Before I get to the fireworks, you need to understand the battlefield. I'm a real estate attorney. For 30 years, my world has been deeds, titles, easements, and the beautiful, infuriating complexity of property law. I don't just read the fine print, I write it. I live it. It's the architecture of ownership, and I was one of its master builders. When my wife, Sarah, passed away, the big house in the city felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. The silence was deafening. So, I sold it. I wanted something smaller, something with peace built into its foundation. I found it in a quiet corner of a planned community called Whispering Pines. The name was a bit on the nose, but the sales pitch was tranquility. The property was unique. It was a modest 2-bedroom house, but it backed onto a small, 5-acre, spring-fed lake. It wasn't a shared lakefront property. The entire lake, from the cattails on my side to the muddy bank on the other, was included in the parcel. The property line was drawn around the entire body of water. I checked the deed 3 times, ran a title search that went back to the original land grant, and personally reviewed the county plat maps. It was my lake. Legally, unequivocally, mine. It was the reason I paid a premium for the lot. It was where Sarah and I would have put a canoe. I moved in on a Tuesday. By Friday, I'd met the Queen. Her name was Brenda Miller, and she was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. She introduced herself while I was struggling with a flat-pack bookshelf in my garage. She didn't offer to help. She just stood there, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, with an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something foul. "You're the new owner of Lot 72, she stated. It wasn't a question. "Mark Jensen," I said, offering a hand she didn't take. "And you are?" "Brenda Miller. HOA president," she tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "I'll need you to move your vehicle. It's been parked in the same spot on the street for more than 4 hours. That's a violation of Section 12, Paragraph C." I looked at my sedan, parked neatly against the curb in front of my own house. I looked at the moving truck in my driveway. "I'm still moving in, Brenda." "The rules don't make exceptions for moving in," she said, her voice as crisp and unforgiving as a saltine cracker. "Consider this a verbal warning. The next time it will be a $25 fine." She made a note on her clipboard, turned on her heel, and marched away. I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the tranquil paradise I'd hoped for. My initial annoyance was a low hum, like a refrigerator you don't notice until it stops. This was just a woman drunk on a tiny sip of power. I could handle that. I dealt with far worse in depositions. The first few weeks were a series of petty paper cuts. A notice about my garbage cans being visible from the street for 65 minutes after the designated pickup time. A warning about the species of flowers I planted in my front yard not being on the pre-approved list. I read the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS, from cover to cover. She was technically correct on most of them, if you interpreted them with the charity of a hanging judge. I complied, not because I was afraid of her, but because my goal was peace. I just wanted to be left alone to grieve and build a new, quiet life. The real war began, as they often do, over a piece of paper. It arrived in my mailbox, a crisp white envelope with the Whispering Pines HOA logo embossed in the corner. Inside was a letter, typed in a stern Times New Roman font. It informed me that the HOA board had unanimously voted to designate the body of water on Lot 72 as a community recreational area. It instructed me to remove my private property and no trespassing signs immediately. It concluded by stating that failure to comply would result in a $50 daily fine. I read it twice. Then I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in months. It was so absurd, so legally baseless, it was almost comical. It was like getting a letter from your neighbor claiming your living room was now a public park. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. A massive, arrogant, incompetent misunderstanding. My professional training kicked in. I didn't get angry, I got organized. I drafted a polite but firm response. I cited the specific legal description of my property from the recorded deed. I referenced the official county plat map, number 345B, which clearly showed the boundaries. I attached a copy of my title insurance policy. I explained, in the simplest possible terms, that an HOA has no authority to unilaterally seize private property. It's a concept so fundamental to American law that I felt silly even typing it out. I ended the letter by stating that I considered the matter closed and would not be removing my signs or paying any fines. I sent it via certified mail. That, I thought, would be the end of it. How wrong I was. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. Brenda wasn't just mistaken, she was on a mission. And I, and my little lake, were standing in her way. The low hum of annoyance was starting to buzz like high-tension wires in a storm. Brenda's response to my legally airtight letter was to completely ignore it. The daily fines started appearing in my mailbox like clockwork. Then came the public shaming. A notice went up on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive prose. It spoke of a certain resident who was hoarding a valuable community resource and refusing to cooperate for the good of the neighborhood. It didn't name me, but everyone knew who Lot 72 belonged to. I saw my neighbors looking at me differently. Some offered a hesitant, sympathetic smile. Others hurried past, avoiding eye contact. They were afraid of her. That's when I realized the scope of her power here. It wasn't legal power, it was social. She had cultivated an atmosphere of fear, and in that small pond, she was the great white shark. The escalation continued. One Saturday afternoon, I saw a family I didn't recognize setting up a picnic blanket by the edge of my lake. The father was trying to teach his young son how to skip stones. I walked down to them, my heart pounding with a frustration I hadn't felt in years. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm sorry, but this is private property." The men looked up, confused. But the notice said it was a community lake now. The notice was incorrect, I explained patiently. This is my land. The HOA has no claim to it. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The man's wife shot me a dirty look, gathered their things, and muttered something about selfish rich people. They left, but the encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth. Brenda wasn't just harassing me, she was using other people as pawns, setting me up to be the villain in her twisted little narrative. The next week, it was teenagers. A group of them, emboldened by Brenda's campaign, started using the far side of the lake as a hangout spot. They left behind a trail of empty soda cans and candy wrappers. I cleaned it up, my jaw tight. This was a systematic campaign of attrition. She was trying to wear me down, to make owning the lake more trouble than it was worth. Every action she took was like a bad legal argument, full of bluster but devoid of substance. She was filing frivolous motions in the court of public opinion. But as any lawyer knows, even a frivolous motion requires a response. It drains your time, your energy, your will to fight. And that was her goal. The turning point came on a cool October evening. It was the anniversary of the day Sarah and I had closed on our first house together. I was feeling particularly low, adrift in a sea of memories. I decided to walk down to the small wooden dock I'd built. It wasn't much, just a simple platform where I could sit and watch the sunset. Sarah would have loved it. As I got closer, I saw something was wrong. The lines were jagged, unnatural. My stomach dropped. Someone had taken a saw or an axe to the support beams. The dock was collapsing into the water. And there, spray-painted in garish red letters across the remaining planks, was a single word, share. That was it. The moment the switch flipped. This was no longer a legal dispute or a neighborhood squabble. This was a direct, malicious attack on my home, on the one place I had found a sliver of peace. It was an invasion. They had crossed a line etched not in law books, but in something far more fundamental. I stood there in the fading light, the smell of cut pine and spray paint hanging in the air. The sadness I'd been carrying for a year solidified into something else. It became cold, hard, and sharp. It became resolve. Brenda Miller had mistaken my desire for peace as a weakness. She thought my patient, legalistic responses were signs of a man who could be pushed around. She had fundamentally misjudged her opponent. I wasn't just some guy who owned a lake. I was a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling the arguments of bullies just like her. I went back inside, not with anger, but with a chilling sense of clarity. The time for letters was over. The time for being reasonable was over. Brenda wanted a war. She was about to get one. But I wouldn't be fighting with spray paint and vandalism. I'd be fighting with discovery, depositions, and the full, crushing weight of the law. I was no longer a peace-seeking homeowner. I was a prosecutor, and she was my defendant. My quiet little house had just become my war room. The investigation had begun. My first step was to treat this like any complex case, gather intelligence. Who was Brenda Miller, really? What was her motivation? This level of aggression wasn't just about a power trip, there had to be something more. People like Brenda, the ones who crave control, are almost always hiding a weakness. My job was to find it and press on it until the whole rotten structure collapsed. I spent the next weekend at my old law firm's office, using their access to professional databases. I ran a full background check on Brenda and her husband, Frank. They were clean, at least on the surface. No criminal records, no major lawsuits. But their financial picture was interesting. They lived in one of the largest houses in Whispering Pines, drove new luxury cars, and took expensive vacations, all on Frank's modest salary as a mid-level manager at a regional insurance company. It didn't add up. It was like a column of figures that refused to balance. Next, I went to the county records office. I pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation, all their filed tax returns, and the minutes from every board meeting for the past 5 years. I spent hours hunched over a dusty table, poring over pages of dry, bureaucratic language. It was tedious, but it was my element. This was the raw material of truth. Most of it was boilerplate nonsense. But then I found the budget documents. The numbers were sloppy. There were large, recurring payments to a handful of vendors for landscaping, pool maintenance, and community upkeep. The amounts seemed inflated, but without the original contracts, I couldn't prove it. The most curious line item was a recurring consulting fee paid to a company called Lakeside Development LLC. The name jumped out at me. A quick corporate search revealed that Lakeside Development LLC was a single-member corporation. The sole member and registered agent, Frank Miller, Brenda's husband. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was it. This was the crack in the foundation. It was a blatant conflict of interest, and almost certainly a vehicle for embezzlement. Brenda, as president, was approving payments from the HOA's coffers directly into her husband's pocket for consulting services that were probably never rendered. This was a solid start, but I needed more. I needed a human source, someone inside the community who knew where the rest of the bodies were buried. And I knew just the men to talk to. George Peterson was a retired county surveyor who lived 3 streets over. He was a notorious grump who had a long-running feud with Brenda over the placement of his garden gnome. According to community gossip, Brenda had tried to fine him into oblivion, but George, who knew the property lines and bylaws better than she did, had fought her to a standstill. He was the one person in Whispering Pines who wasn't afraid of her. I found him in his yard, meticulously trimming his hedges. I introduced myself and explained my situation with the lake. George put down his shears and a slow grin spread across his weathered face. Brenda wants your lake, does she? Sounds about right. That woman would try to annex heaven if she thought she could get away with it. I told him what I'd found about Lakeside Development LLC. He nodded, not surprised at all. I knew it. I always knew she was skimming. The books never made sense. Did you know she pushed through a special assessment last year for emergency storm drain repairs? Cost every homeowner $500. A week later, she and Frank were on a 2-week cruise to Alaska. This was good. This was motive. This was a pattern of behavior. George, I said, I'm building a case against her. A real one. I need to be legally unassailable. Would you be willing to conduct a new, fully certified survey of my property? I want to have an ironclad, up-to-the-minute document showing my exact property lines. For you, son. He clapped me on the shoulder. I do it for free. Anyone who takes on that she-devil is a friend of mine. While George prepared the new survey, I dove deeper into the history of Whispering Pines itself. Back at the records office, I pulled the original master plan filed by the developer a decade ago. It was a sprawling document full of promises and projections. And there, on page 47, was the smoking gun. The developer had designated a 3-acre parcel of land near the community entrance as a future community recreation area, complete with a planned clubhouse and swimming pool. It was meant to be the centerpiece of the neighborhood. But it had never been built. I cross-referenced the parcel number. The land was still owned by the developer's holding company, which had gone bankrupt years ago. The HOA had never taken ownership. But here was the interesting part: according to the HOA's own financial statements, they had been paying Lakeside Development LLC a hefty annual fee for the planning and pre-development of that very same recreation area. An area they didn't own and had no legal right to develop. Brenda wasn't just skimming. She was running a long con. She was billing the residents for a phantom project, funneling their money into her husband's company, and no one had ever bothered to check the land records. The lake now made perfect sense. She didn't just want it for community access, she wanted an asset. If she could somehow wrestle control of my lake, she could present it to the community as the long-promised recreation area. It would justify her past expenditures, solidify her power, and maybe even allow her to apply for grants or special funding she could also divert. It was ambitious, it was audacious, and it was deeply, profoundly illegal. Now I had the why. I had the means. All I needed was to set the stage for her to hang herself. My plan began to form, not just as a legal strategy, but as a piece of theater. It would have 3 acts. Act 1, the bait. Act 2, the trap. Act 3, the takedown. Brenda thought this was a battle of wills. She was wrong. This was a battle of intellect, and she'd brought a clipboard to a law library. The time for defense was over. It was time to go on the attack. The first phase of my plan was meticulous documentation. I installed a state-of-the-art security system. Not the kind you buy at a big-box store, but a professional-grade setup with motion-activated, night vision cameras. They were small, discreet, and covered every inch of my property line, with a particular focus on the lake and the vandalized dock. Every trespass, every piece of litter, every furtive glance would be captured in crystal-clear 4K resolution. I was creating a visual record of her harassment campaign. Next, I crafted another letter to the HOA board. This one was different. It wasn't a defense, it was a warning. I formally put them on notice, as a board and as individuals, of the ongoing trespassing and vandalism. I included photos of the damage to my dock. I stated that any further incursions would be reported to the sheriff's department and that I would hold the board members personally and civilly liable for any damages incurred due to their encouragement of this behavior. This was a legal shot across the bow, designed to rattle her cronies on the board. A $50 fine is one thing, being named in a lawsuit is quite another. I sent it via courier, requiring a signature from each board member. But the centerpiece of Act 1 was the sign. It was my masterpiece of malicious compliance. I took down my simple, private property signs. In their place, I erected a large, professionally printed sign right at the main path leading to the lake. It read, Whispering Pines Community Access Point. As designated by HOA Board. Warning, swim at your own risk. Water source is subject to unfiltered agricultural runoff from adjacent properties. Periodic testing has indicated the presence of high levels of E. coli and other bacteria. No lifeguard on duty. Submerged hazards present. By entering this area, you and your family assume all risk of injury, illness, or death. The Whispering Pines HOA and its board members assume all legal and financial liability for any incidents. Every word of it was technically true, if framed in the most alarming way possible. All natural lakes have bacteria. All bodies of water have risks. But the masterstroke was the final line. I was turning Brenda's own power play against her. If she declared it a community asset, then she and her board were accepting liability for it. I knew for a fact the HOA's insurance policy had a massive exclusion for any incidents on non-owned, non-insured properties. This sign put her in an impossible position. To leave it up was to accept a terrifying legal risk. To take it down was to admit the lake wasn't a community asset after all. I set it up on a Saturday morning. Within an hour, my phone started ringing. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Brenda, of course. Her voice was a screech of pure fury. "Mr. Jensen. This is Brenda Miller. You take that sign down this instant. This is a flagrant violation. It's slanderous. You are creating a public nuisance. I am calling an emergency board meeting. You will be hearing from our attorney." I smiled. The bait was in the water, and the shark was circling. A few days passed. The sign stayed up. I noticed a distinct lack of picnickers and teenage loiterers. It seemed the fear of E. coli and lawsuits was more persuasive than Brenda's community spirit propaganda. I could feel her rage simmering from across the neighborhood. She was used to people cowering. My cheerful, legally sound defiance was driving her insane. She was a bully, and the one thing a bully can't stand is being laughed at. The trap sprung on a Wednesday night. It was just after 11 p.m. My phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. Motion detected at the dock. I pulled up the live feed on my tablet. The night vision camera showed two figures creeping onto my property. One was tall and lanky, the other shorter, more stout. They were carrying tools. It was Brenda and her husband, Frank. I watched, my heart hammering in my chest, a cold, triumphant feeling washing over me. They went straight for the sign. Frank produced a crowbar and began trying to pry it from its posts. Brenda stood guard, pacing back and forth like a paranoid little dictator. After a few minutes of struggling with the sign, they gave up and turned their attention to the already damaged dock. Frank started kicking at the remaining support posts, trying to finish the job. It was all there. In high definition. Criminal trespass. Destruction of property. Conspiracy. I recorded the entire 20-minute escapade. I saved the file to 3 separate hard drives and a cloud server. This was the silver bullet. This was irrefutable proof of their personal involvement. They weren't just encouraging harassment, they were actively participating in it. The next day, there was a notice for a mandatory HOA meeting. The agenda item was, addressing resident misinformation and property violations. It was clearly about me and my sign. This was it. This was the stage for Act 2. The community center was packed. Brenda had clearly whipped the neighborhood into a frenzy. I saw fear on some faces, anger on others. I walked in and took a seat in the front row. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see that I wasn't intimidated. George gave me a subtle nod from across the room. Brenda stood at the podium, radiating self-righteous indignation. She launched into a tirade about community values, about sharing, about the selfish actions of one individual who sought to undermine the harmony of Whispering Pines. She never used my name, but her eyes were locked on mine. This individual has gone so far as to erect a dangerous and slanderous sign, designed to frighten residents and prevent them from enjoying the beautiful natural resources that belong to all of us, she thundered. She paused for dramatic effect. Therefore, the board has voted to levy a special fine of $1,000 against the owner of Lot 72 for creating a public hazard. Furthermore, we will be hiring a contractor to remove the offending sign and the illegal dock structure, and the cost will be billed directly to the homeowner. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. $1,000 fine. It was an absurd overreach, a declaration of total power. Brenda wasn't finished. We are also exploring our legal options to have the lake officially rezoned for public use. We will not be bullied. The room was silent. This was my cue. I raised my hand. Brenda, I said, my voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension. Before the community votes on this, I have a question. She glared at me. This is not a debate, Mr. Jensen. Oh, I think it is, I said, standing up. My question is about property damage. Specifically, the damage done to my dock last night at approximately 11:15 p.m. I was just wondering if the board has any policy regarding board members who are caught on camera committing criminal acts on a resident's property. I didn't shout. I didn't get angry. I just let the question hang in the air. The color drained from Brenda's face. Frank, who was sitting with the other board members, looked like he was about to be sick. The room erupted in whispers. What are you talking about? Brenda stammered, her composure cracking. That's a baseless accusation. Is it? I asked, holding up my phone. Because I find that modern technology is remarkable. 4K video, even in the dark. It's amazing what you can see. I didn't show the video. Not yet. That wasn't the point of Act 2. The point was to sow doubt. The point was to let her know that I knew. I wanted her to squirm. I wanted her to spend the next few days in a panic, wondering what I had and what I was going to do with it. The motion for the $1,000 fine was quietly tabled. The meeting ended in a state of confused chaos. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. I had exposed a crack in her armor. Now it was time to bring the whole thing crashing down. Her panicked reaction told me everything I needed to know. She was guilty, and she was scared. A scared tyrant is a dangerous tyrant. I knew her next move would be desperate and vicious. And I was ready for it. Brenda's retreat at the HOA meeting was tactical, not a surrender. I knew that. I had wounded her pride and challenged her authority in public. A person like her couldn't let that stand. Her retaliation came faster and was far uglier than I had anticipated. She was no longer trying to win the argument, she was trying to destroy me personally. She launched a full-scale smear campaign. It started on the community's private Facebook group. A post from Brenda appeared, dripping with manufactured concern. Dear neighbors, it began, it has come to my attention that the new resident in Lot 72, Mark Jensen, has a history that may be alarming to those of us with children. While I cannot share details due to privacy laws, I urge you all to be vigilant. The board is taking steps to ensure community safety. The implication was vile, unmistakable, and utterly false. She was painting me as a predator. It was pure, unadulterated libel. The comments section exploded with a mix of panic and support for Brenda's bravery. My quiet, peaceful neighborhood was turning into a witch hunt, with me as the witch. But she didn't stop there. The next day, I received a call from the managing partner at my law firm, a man I'd known for 20 years. His voice was strained. Mark, he said, I just had a very strange call from a woman named Brenda Miller. President of your HOA. Let me guess, I said, a cold knot forming in my stomach. She told you I was an unstable, dangerous individual who was harassing his neighbors. Worse, he replied. She claimed you were under investigation for financial crimes and that you'd been disbarred in another state under a different name. She said the firm should distance itself from you before the scandal breaks. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, but I pushed it down. This was a gift. She was escalating her attacks from civil matters to criminal defamation. She was digging her own grave deeper with every lie. John, I said calmly, I need you to do me a favor. Write down everything you remember her saying, word for word. Have your assistant witness it. Date it and sign it. This is no longer an HOA dispute. This is a legal matter. He agreed without hesitation. Brenda had overplayed her hand. Attacking me was one thing, attacking my professional reputation was like walking into a lion's den and trying to steal its food. Her vicious, desperate attacks were having an unintended consequence. They were creating evidence. Every false post, every slanderous phone call was another nail in her coffin. But I still needed the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable proof of the financial crimes that would transform this from a local drama into a felony case. And then, as if summoned by the sheer force of Brenda's villainy, the whistleblower appeared. It came as an anonymous email to my work address. The subject line was simple, Whispering Pines HOA. The email read, I know what my mother is doing. It's wrong. She's been stealing from the HOA for years through my dad's company. She's trying to ruin you because you're the first person who's ever stood up to her. I have proof. Invoices. Bank statements. If you can guarantee I remain anonymous, I will help you. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. My mother, it had to be her son or daughter. A quick search of her social media showed she had one child, a son in his early 20s named Kevin. He had recently moved out of his parents' house after a public falling out. This was the ultimate insider. I replied immediately, using a secure, encrypted email service. I assured him of anonymity and thanked him for his courage. We arranged a phone call. Kevin's voice was young and full of a weary anger. He told me the story of growing up under Brenda's oppressive thumb. He said that Lakeside Development LLC scheme was her retirement plan. She'd been siphoning money for years, billing the HOA for landscaping that was never done, repairs that were never made, and, of course, the phantom planning for the community center they never intended to build. Then he dropped the bombshell that tied everything together. The reason she's so obsessed with your lake, he explained, is not just about ego. She found out about a state-level green spaces grant. It provides significant funding to communities for the development of public recreational waterfronts. Her plan was to seize your lake, declare it a public park, and then apply for a massive grant. The grant money would, of course, be paid to Lakeside Development LLC to manage the project. She was going to drain the community coffers and the state treasury at the same time. Your refusal to back down is threatening her big score. It was perfect. It was a grand, unified theory of her corruption. It explained the desperation, the viciousness, the sheer irrationality of her campaign. It was never just about the lake, it was about the multi-layered fraud the lake was supposed to enable. I have the documents, Kevin said. I worked for my dad's company for a summer. I know where he keeps the files. I copied everything. Fake invoices, bank statements showing the transfers from the HOA account to their personal accounts. It's all there. This was the kill shot. This was no longer a civil matter of property lines and defamation. This was felony wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. This was state and potentially federal jurisdiction. Kevin sent me the files through a secure server. It was a treasure trove of criminality. Invoices for 1,000 phantom rose bushes. Bills for emergency asbestos abatement in the community clubhouse that didn't have asbestos. And the detailed proposal for the grant application, with my lake listed as the centerpiece. I now had everything I needed. My meticulously organized case file was nearly complete. I had the undisputed property deed and survey. I had the 4K video of Brenda and Frank committing criminal trespass and property destruction. I had the sworn statement from my firm's managing partner about her slanderous accusations. And now, I had a thick folder of documents detailing years of systematic financial fraud. I didn't go to the local sheriff. This was too complex for a small-town department, and I couldn't risk the case getting lost in bureaucracy or local politics. Brenda was well connected in town. No, this required a bigger gun. The next morning, I put on my best suit. I drove an hour into the city, to the state capitol. I walked into the offices of the state attorney general, specifically the Public Integrity and White-Collar Crime Division. I secured a meeting with a senior prosecutor. I laid my file on his conference table. I started at the beginning, the lake, the deed, the initial harassment. Then I moved to the vandalism, presenting the video evidence. I followed with the defamation, presenting the signed statement. And for the grand finale, I presented the financial documents from Kevin. I watched the prosecutor's expression change from professional skepticism to focused intensity. He picked up one of the fake invoices from Lakeside Development LLC. "Mr. Jensen," he said slowly, looking up at me. "You've done our job for us. This is one of the cleanest, most well-documented cases of public corruption I've ever seen." He assured me his office would be opening a full investigation immediately and that everything would be handled with the utmost discretion until it was time to act. I walked out of that building into the bright sunshine, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The final act was in motion. The trap was no longer just set, the authorities were now waiting in the wings. Brenda had called for a special community meeting to vote on taking legal action to seize my property, an action as ludicrous as an HOA trying to declare war on a foreign country. She intended it to be her final, public victory. She had no idea it was going to be her execution. The night of the special meeting felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The community center was even more crowded than last time. Brenda had billed this as the final showdown, the moment the community would rise up and take back what was, rightfully theirs. She stood at the podium, beaming, looking every bit the conquering hero of her own delusion. Her board members sat behind her, a row of nodding sycophants. I arrived a few minutes late, by design. I brought George with me for moral support. As I walked in, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to me. Brenda smirked, clearly interpreting my presence as the last gasp of a defeated man. "Ah, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Glad you could make it. You're just in time to witness true community democracy in action." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Brenda," I said, taking my seat in the front row once again. She launched into her prepared speech. It was a rambling, self-aggrandizing monologue about her tireless service to Whispering Pines, her vision for a more inclusive community, and the unfortunate necessity of dealing with selfish individuals who stood in the way of progress. "This vote," she declared, her voice rising, "is about more than just a lake. It's about our values. It's about whether we are a community that shares, or one that allows individuals to hoard resources for their own private pleasure." She was working the crowd into a righteous lather. I let her go on. I needed her to climb as high as possible on her soapbox, to make the fall that much more spectacular. Just as she was about to call for the vote, two men in plain suits entered quietly through the back door and stood along the wall. They were utterly unremarkable, which in that context made them stand out like sore thumbs. Brenda didn't notice them. Her focus was entirely on me. That was my cue. I stood up. "Brenda, before you call that vote," I said, my voice cutting through the room, "I believe the community deserves to have all the facts. Specifically, about where their money has been going." A projector screen I had arranged with George to be set up earlier hummed to life behind her. An image appeared on it, the first fraudulent invoice from Lakeside Development LLC for Community Center Pre-Development Planning. Brenda spun around, her face a mask of confusion and fury. "What is this? Who authorized this?" "I think you did," I said calmly. "Could you please explain to the residents why the HOA has paid over $200,000 over the last 5 years to a company owned by your husband, Frank, for work on a community center on land the HOA has never owned?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. I clicked the remote, and the next invoice appeared. And the next. Landscaping for Phantom Gardens. Pool chemicals for a pool that didn't exist. Consulting fees for projects that lived only on paper. "And perhaps," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "you could explain your plan to apply for a 6-figure state grant using my private property as the qualifying asset, a grant that would have been paid directly to your husband's shell company." The room was dead silent now. The residents were looking from the screen to Brenda, their expressions shifting from anger at me to dawning, horrified comprehension. They were seeing, for the first time, the woman behind the curtain. Brenda started to sputter. "Lies. These are forged documents. This is a conspiracy. He's a criminal trying to deflect from his own actions." Her eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but she found none. The faces that had adored her moments before were now cold and accusing. Her power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, was evaporating in real time. Then she saw her son, Kevin, standing near the back, his face grim. Her rage found a target. "You," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You did this. You traitorous little brat. I gave you everything." It was at that moment that the two men in suits began to walk forward. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that silenced the room completely. The lead investigator held up his badge. "Brenda Miller," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You and Frank Miller are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement." The collective gasp in the room was like the wind being sucked out of a vacuum. Frank Miller looked like he was going to faint. Brenda's face went through a rapid series of emotions, disbelief, rage, and finally, pure, unadulterated panic. "You can't do this," she screamed as the second investigator placed her hands behind her back. "I am the president of this association. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," the investigator recited in a monotone as the handcuffs clicked shut. The entire community watched, stunned, as their queen was dethroned. As they led her past me, her face was a twisted mask of hatred. She stopped and leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "You will regret this," she hissed. "I will destroy you. I will own that lake if it's the last thing I do." It was the last, hollow threat of a tyrant who had just lost everything. Her power was gone. Her credibility was shattered. Her house of cards had not just collapsed, it had been incinerated. I just looked at her. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The quiet click of the community center door closing behind her was the only response needed. The war was over. I had won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The news of Brenda and Frank's arrest spread through Whispering Pines like a wildfire. The HOA was thrown into chaos. The remaining board members, all of whom had been Brenda's loyal puppets, resigned in disgrace within 48 hours, fearing they would be implicated in the scandal. An emergency election was held. George, the grumpy surveyor who had been my first and most steadfast ally, was unanimously elected as the interim president. His first official act was to call a special meeting, not in the soulless community center, but as an informal gathering in the park. At that meeting, the community formally voted to void every fine Brenda had ever levied against me. They issued a public, written apology, which they posted on the same bulletin board she had used for her campaign of shame. They also voted to hire an independent forensic accountant to go through the last 5 years of the HOA's finances to determine the full extent of the Millers' theft. The community began to heal. The atmosphere of fear that Brenda had cultivated for so long dissipated, replaced by a sense of liberation and cooperation. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been pitted against one another were now working together to reform the bylaws, stripping out the petty, controlling rules and focusing on what mattered. It was a renaissance in miniature. As for Brenda and Frank, their downfall was total and mercilessly public. The state attorney's case against them was overwhelming. The combination of my meticulous documentation and Kevin's insider evidence was a legal sledgehammer. Faced with a mountain of proof, they pled guilty to avoid a trial that would have been a media circus. The judge was not lenient. Citing the egregious breach of public trust and the sheer audacity of their long-running scheme, he sentenced them both to significant prison time. Brenda got 7 years in a state penitentiary, Frank got 5. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a figure the forensic accountant eventually calculated to be just over $300,000. Their assets were seized. The big house, the luxury cars, the vacation fund, it was all liquidated to pay back the community they had plundered. They lost everything, their freedom, their money, and their status. The name Miller became a cautionary tale in Whispering Pines, a synonym for corruption and hubris. A few weeks after the sentencing, I was sitting on my newly repaired dock. George had helped me rebuild it, stronger than before. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of orange and purple. The air was still and quiet, filled only with the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. My private property signs were back up, standing undisturbed. Sometimes, neighbors would walk by on the path and wave. A few had even stopped by with baked goods or a bottle of wine, clumsy but sincere apologies for ever doubting me. I held no grudges. They were victims of the same tyrant, just in a different way. I thought about the long, exhausting battle. I had never wanted a fight. I had come to this place seeking sanctuary, a quiet corner of the world to mourn and remember. Instead, I'd been drawn into a war. But in fighting it, I had found something I hadn't expected. A sense of purpose. A community. My legal skills, for so long just a tool for my career, had become a shield and a sword. They had protected my home, my peace, and the memory of what this place was supposed to be for Sarah and me. There was a profound, poetic justice in it all. Brenda had tried to use a warped version of the law, the HOA bylaws, to steal from me. In the end, she was brought down by the true, unyielding power of actual law. The lake was calm. The whispers in the pines were no longer her threats and accusations, but just the gentle sound of the wind. My life was finally my own again. The peace I had come here for had been threatened, but in defending it, I had secured it more completely than I ever could have imagined. I had found my tranquility, not by avoiding a storm, but by navigating through it and emerging into the quiet on the other side. And it was more beautiful than I could have ever hoped.